And welcome to episode 65 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Hennig. On this edition of the podcast, we are going to do a little bit of a different type of pod. It's not a specific review of a show or a movie, but more of an explanation for what you are seeing and the connectivity of it in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. For those of you who have or are going to watch the first 4 episodes of WandaVision on Disney+, this is an explanation of S.W.O.R.D., how it's related in the MCU, and what this has to do with the television show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. So let's open up a cold one and get started on episode 65 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. In episode 4 of WandaVision, you are finally cued in on at least a little bit more information about what is going on in the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the world after Avengers Endgame. And I will preface this by spoilers. These are not specific spoilers for the television show, but more so spoilers for the ongoing Marvel Cinematic Universe story arc that is currently going on. Also, this episode of the podcast is not an explanation or review of WandaVision, the show, at all. This is strictly a explanation for what is S.W.O.R.D., why it's relevant, and the interconnectivity of the full MCU, because I feel like there was a lot of things that happened in episode 4 that might have overwhelmed some people. In fact, I had to watch the episode twice myself just to catch everything I wanted to catch. So the reason why we're getting into this episode, the reason why Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., the TV show, has something to do with this, is because for those of you who have not seen the end of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which was last summer, which I understand there's a lot going on in our world, the end of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. in its final season really left the door open to do whatever they wanted with the characters. There was nobody who specifically died who was relevant. There was pretty much all happy endings for almost everyone of relevance on the show. Remember that the Doctor Strange movie is going to directly deal with all multiverse issues. And WandaVision is setting the groundwork for what you're going to see in Doctor Strange Into the Multiverse of Madness. And the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. show deals specifically with alternate realities and alternate timelines in the same way, but a more thorough way that Avengers Endgame does. And the reason why this is important and what this has to do with the agency S.W.O.R.D. is because for most people who are watching the show, the only way Vision is alive is either, in the television show, is either he comes from an alternate reality where he didn't die, or Wanda created him for the purpose of the world that she's living in. Now, either scenario gets deeper into WandaVision and the purpose of the show. And again, we are not going to review WandaVision until the show is completely done because I don't want to make any false assumptions. So, back to S.H.I.E.L.D. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. dealt with time travel. It dealt with alternate realities. It dealt with a lot of things that you initially saw in Avengers Endgame. And Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. left off with the possibility they could come back. And now we're seeing in the news that Disney and Marvel are discussing the possibility of an Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. spinoff and bringing all seasons of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. to Disney+. Now we have S.W.O.R.D. S.W.O.R.D. is the new S.H.I.E.L.D. of the Marvel Cinematic Universe in a post-Avengers Endgame world. Now, I'm not going to get into the history of S.W.O.R.D. in the comics because it's a little different and it's not relevant to our conversation. But I will say that S.W.O.R.D. in the comics is an entity that is much more intricate, much deeper, and much more involved than what you've even seen from S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, S.W.O.R.D. stands for Sentient Weapon Observation Response Division. Basically, it's a nice little acronym to basically say they can do whatever they want. They're in charge of whatever they want to say they're in charge of, because sentient can be anything. Weapon can be defined as anything. Observation means you can just be involved in anything. Response is a fluid term, and division basically just means we're all in that group. So let's be realistic. SWORD is an agency that can do whatever they want, whenever they want. The purpose of SWORD came out of Captain Marvel. Remember, at the end of the Captain Marvel movie, you were left with Captain Marvel's friend Maria Rambeau on Earth behind after Captain Marvel went off into outer space. Well, Maria Rambeau founded SWORD, and the idea is that she founded SWORD with the purpose of dealing with the potential that what if there is an evil version of her friend that shows up? Because Captain Marvel is arguably, if not one of the most powerful characters in all of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So the idea is that when you're dealing with threats that are unknown and unseen, you have to prepare for everything. So the idea is SWORD deals with space missions. They deal with threats. They're supposed to protect Earth. Now, you might ask, well, where was SWORD when the alien invasion of New York happened? The reason why SWORD wasn't involved in that, and this hasn't been expressly explained yet, but this is a fairly obvious piece together, okay? That was a S.H.I.E.L.D. issue. SWORD wasn't involved in Thor. They weren't involved in Avengers. They didn't know about the intricate details. And remember, in the MCU, there's no Patriot Act as we know of, so there's no forced sharing of intelligence between agencies. S.H.I.E.L.D. can do what it wants. SWORD can do what it wants. They don't have to tell each other. It is what it is. So that's why SWORD wasn't there to save the day when there was the Chitauri invasion of Earth, which is also why they weren't involved in Age of Ultron, because that was a Avengers problem, not a SWORD investigation. And probably at that point, SWORD was more worried about not getting wrapped up in the fallout of S.H.I.E.L.D. being exposed and Hydra being outed around the world. They didn't want to be looped into all that. So probably just stuck to their other stuff they were doing. So it's a very convenient reason why SWORD has not been a factor until now. And the reason why it's a factor now is because of Monica Rambeau, who you are introduced to in the show. Monica Rambeau, played by Teyonah Parris, who I really hope they keep her long term as this character, because I think that she embodies the character perfectly of Monica Rambeau. I don't even care if they make her wholly comic book accurate. The fact that the character personality is right. Miss Parris does an incredible job, and I'm very thrilled with her playing this role, because for those who don't know, Monica Rambeau in the comics became a very powerful character, but she was originally not a superpowered character. She was just a powerful character. I don't care if they make her a powerful character or not. I like the fact that they're keeping with the personality of the Marvel Cinematic Universe's purpose for her character. The daughter Maria Rambeau, she's older now. She's involved in SWORD. And the reason why she's relevant is because, as you see in episode 4, she was one of the people who was blipped. She was one of the people who was disappeared when Thanos snapped his fingers. And she thinks she took a 20-minute nap and she woke up. She finds out that she's been gone for 5 years. And when the Avengers brought everyone back that Thanos killed, she shows up. She thinks she's there for her mother's coming out of surgery. She finds out her mother died a few years earlier before she came back. She then goes back to SWORD, the agency, and you get a good glimpse around the building. You get a good glimpse about the fact that they have adjusted their mission, that SWORD is filling the void of there being no S.H.I.E.L.D. anymore. And I'll get to why Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. has something to do with that in a minute. But if you remember, when they undid Thanos' snap, you are now exposed in this episode to the chaos that comes from all these people suddenly coming back from what people presumed was dead or disappeared or whatever you want to call it. The Spider-Man movie kind of makes light of it, the happy side of it. Oh, my friend is back. Oh, my life is back. Oh, my world is back. WandaVision, episode 4, gets into the dark side of it, of how people showed up and people were dead, and people showed up and people's lives had gone on, and people showed up and they're not allowed to do certain jobs anymore, and people came back to life, and the world was very different than the one that they left. And that's why at one point they compliment Monica Rambeau and they say, wow, you're adjusting really well. To which her response is, I have no real choice to not respond to this at this point. So if you think about it, there were people who were flying airplanes who disappeared and they came back. There are people who did all these different things and now they're back. And they're like, well, what happened? And everyone says, well, you weren't here for 5 years. That's going to fill you in. And for some people, that's probably very traumatic. And for other people, like Monica Rambeau, they're just very matter of fact about it. And they say, all right, well, it is what it is. So SWORD is the agency that is investigating the phenomenon that you are seeing in WandaVision. And the reason why it's important to understand that they are the agency investigating is because you also see in episode 4 the collaboration between SWORD and the FBI. Welcome back, Jimmy Woo, played by Randall Park. Mr. Agent Woo was in Ant-Man and the Wasp, so a little more connectivity to the MCU. And the relevance of him and Darcy Lewis, who you've seen in the Thor movies working together, is Marvel is trying to establish and drive home everything's connected. It's all under one umbrella. These are not independent franchises anymore. I told you guys before, and I'll tell you again a million times. Phase 4 is all about building a foundation. Everything that happened in the last 13 years of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, everything that you saw for phases 1, 2, and 3, that's one arc. That's one set of stories. This is a completely new set of stories. Think about it like this. For anybody who's ever read a series of fiction novels, for example, like the Chronicles of Narnia, anyone who's ever read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it's a very long series, actually, of books. It's not a standalone like you may have been told that it is in the movies. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, and The Voyage of the Dawn Treader are technically one arc of characters, whereas The Horse and His Boy, The Magician's Nephew, is another arc of situations and characters and people. And then the last battle is kind of like Avengers Endgame, where it's like a culmination of all these other things. So imagine that the MCU functions as The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And you have these books, right? And you have these primary characters. And then you have one set of story arcs. Then you have another set of story arcs. And then the last battle, or in this case, Avengers Endgame, is the culmination of all of those story arcs. Well, imagine if C.S. Lewis was still alive and he said, I'm going to write about what happens after all those books happened. But it's a whole new world. It's a whole new existence. It's a whole new everything. That's what Marvel is doing here. This is after the 3 Lord of the Rings movies. This is after the last battle book in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is what if Sherlock Holmes died and there was a new Sherlock Holmes in that mythology. Whatever story, fictional world, universe you want to use the analogy to, that's what we're dealing with. And Marvel is trying to explain to everyone watching, this is all together. There's no separateness. There's no people are doing one thing and not doing another thing. This is all part of the world that's been created by the previous 3 phases in phase 4. But phase 4 at the same time is laying the foundation for phases 5 and 6 when we go to the next level with these characters and these stories. So with all that being said, the purpose of S.W.O.R.D. is in many ways like S.H.I.E.L.D. in that is they monitor threats, they deal with threats. They're just a little bit more space aware than S.H.I.E.L.D. was. Now, what does this have to do with the show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.? Well, the introduction of the agency is actually kind of similar to S.H.I.E.L.D. Is that the first time you get the television show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., the only thing you know about the S.H.I.E.L.D. is from the couple movies that it was in. Iron Man, a little bit in Thor, Avengers. That's really it. The purpose of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. originally was to connect between each movie moving forward. That's why they used the character Coulson, who was killed in Avengers and then was brought back to life in the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. show. And that became a part of the story of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was Coulson being brought back to life, Coulson and S.H.I.E.L.D. existing in this new world post-Avengers and trying to still save the world from non-Avengers threats. But what happens in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is that after the first 4 seasons, they cut off from the MCU. But they have been rejoined to the MCU thanks to the quantum realm. If you remember in Avengers Endgame, they used the quantum realm for time travel, and they exist now in a world with potentially multiple realities and outcomes, as explained in Endgame. Well, because of the quantum realm, and because Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. uses the same quantum realm technology that's used in Ant-Man and the Wasp and in Avengers Endgame, S.H.I.E.L.D. has now been brought into the Marvel multiverse, but in a different timeline where Thanos never attacks Earth. Because remember, when Tony Stark does what he does at the end of Avengers Endgame, he eliminates and deals with a Thanos from a different timeline. So when he eliminates Thanos and his allies from that timeline no longer has a Thanos to attack Earth. And theoretically, that is a timeline that S.H.I.E.L.D. exists in. But S.H.I.E.L.D. also exists in another timeline that they left Deacon, one of the characters who showed up in the last few seasons, to run S.H.I.E.L.D. in. Now, follow me for a second. If S.H.I.E.L.D. exists in one reality, but doesn't exist in another reality, and S.W.O.R.D. exists in one reality, but not in the other reality, that's why they could never help each other. And that's where the multiverse is going to come in. The multiverse is going to explain, well, this is where Deadpool came from, who we got from 21st Century Fox. And this is why you haven't seen mutants in the MCU. And this is why what happened in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. happened. And as has been reported that Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield, the 2 previous Spider-Man, are going to be in the next Spider-Man movie. This is why what happened in their movies happened and nobody helped them. Because the idea is that Marvel is going to use the multiverse to explain everything that's happened at any point in time with a Marvel character by saying it didn't happen because they weren't there. It was a different Earth. It was a different reality. And that's where the connection between S.H.I.E.L.D. being kind of left out to dry and S.W.O.R.D. kind of coming out of nowhere pops up, because S.W.O.R.D. is conveniently filling the S.H.I.E.L.D. void. And don't forget that the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. show was originally created to fill the void between the movies. Now, instead of having a show that fills the void between the movies are now basically a part of a story that starts in the television shows. And the reason why that's important to keep in mind is because one of the problems that happened to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. that will not happen to Disney Plus is that the further Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. got away from the MCU, the less interested people got in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. were losing viewers as they went along. In fact, from season 6 to season 7, they lost 1 million viewers. But in the final season, they regained 500,000 viewers. You realize that who your market audience is. And that was something Marvel was having trouble with. See, what's important about S.W.O.R.D. is this is the MCU's way of trying to do Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. right. Trying to do it justice. Because remember, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was a Marvel television property, which was overseen by Jeff Loeb at the time. Jeff Loeb is no longer with Marvel. He was kind of sent packing begrudgingly because he basically said, I want to take my toy and go home. And Marvel said, no, you can leave your toy here and you can go home. To which he said, fine, and left. Jeff Loeb was trying to be the Kevin Feige of the TV universe. Kevin Feige is the man in charge of Marvel's cinematic universe and the head of Marvel Studios. And the big difference between Loeb and Feige is that Feige's background was dealing with Marvel movies and trying his best to make them as close to continuity as possible. So while Kevin Feige's background was purely in how do I take these comic books and turn them into movies, Loeb's background was a little bit more complicated. Jeff Loeb has a dual career, a career where he's worked on comic books and a career where he's worked in television. And the reason why that's an important distinction is because Jeff Loeb's experience working in the comic book industry was in an era of comic books where everything went wrong. The 90s were a bad era for comic books. If you ever want to make someone hate comic books, DC or Marvel, make them read a couple of arcs of the 90s, and they will hate you very quickly for it. In fact, Jeff Loeb worked on some of the most infamous comic book runs of all time in the 90s, including Superman for All Seasons, Catwoman When in Rome, Spider-Man Blue, Hulk Gray. These were some very, very dubious comic book stuff. And part of the reason why he got the opportunity to work on television properties that had something to do with comics was because he was a little more successful with his filmmaking than he was in his comic book writing. So there was this assumption that, well, you know comic books, you know TV, you know what you're doing, you're fine. So Jeff Loeb got brought into Smallville, all right? And he had a couple of work with Miles Millar and Alfred Goh, but Loeb had family issues to get to and the caring of his son. That's why he didn't stay with Smallville long term. Lobo kind of went back to doing television and writing comics for a while until he became the primary executive producer and director of the Marvel television branch known as Marvel Television Studios. And he ran Marvel Television for about 8-9 years. Under his supervision were things like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., the Netflix shows, Daredevil, Luke Cage, Iron Fist. And if you notice, the further along all of his shows went, any of them, the further they got away from the MCU. Because it was almost like Loeb was trying to passive-aggressively express his dislike for what Kevin Feige and Ari Arand and everybody from, Victoria Alonso and everyone involved in Marvel Studios was doing, because he probably secretly wanted to run Marvel Studios. And because it was an easy way for them to cut him loose, for lack of a better term, they basically used the Avengers Endgame and the ending of deals with Netflix and other people to tell Loeb, well, we don't really need you anymore. You can go away now. So the reason why I'm explaining all that is because what Marvel is trying to do now is bring everyone back under the tent. They're trying to bring all their characters back in. They didn't spend $60 billion to buy Fox Studios to not use the characters that they purchased, right? They didn't spend all this time and resources rewriting some of these contract agreements with Sony when it comes to the Spider-Man rights or Universal Studios when it came to the Hulk rights to not use all of these characters. They didn't let all of the agreements with Netflix expire just so they can't use Daredevil and the other characters ever again. So the idea is that what you're seeing with Sword is laying the foundation for what you're going to see when they bring Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. back in. Again, the reports are that there is conversations about having an Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. either direct sequel or a spinoff coming to Disney Plus. And the reason that's important is because the character Quake, played by Chloe Bennett, ends the show in space as part of a team that is going into space to deal with space issues. Well, part of Sword's job is dealing with threats that come from outer space. So if she ends up jumping from timeline to timeline, or we have a convergence of universes, or whatever happens, you can say, all right, well, you can kind of grandfather her into a Sword mission or assignment or something, and that would be part of what's going on. Also, if we're going to be dealing with multiverses as part of Phase 4 and part of Phase 5, don't forget what is coming. The culmination of Phase 4 is the movie Thor: Love and Thunder, which is where Jane Foster ends up becoming Lady Thor, and they have to deal with the supervillain known as God Butcher. The reason that's important is because we're already seeing that Thor: Love and Thunder has a ridiculous cast. This is going to be the next Avengers movie. But they're not going to call it Avengers movie because, well, they just are not. They're not going to. They're just not choosing to do that. But Nebula is going to be in the movie, and Jane Foster, and Korg, and Valkyrie, and Star-Lord, and Sif. Pretty much anybody that's somebody at some point in terms of Thor and his history in the MCU is going to be in this movie. And I think it's very purposeful because they want to end Phase 4 with a big event, a big movie. They're building towards something. They're setting up for something. And that's what Thor: Love and Thunder is. But there can't be a Thor: Love and Thunder if there's not a sword and a shield and a WandaVision to set the groundwork. And I'll just conclude the podcast by saying this. A couple of questions I've seen online about what is going on in WandaVision. I'm not going to answer this question specifically, but I am going to leave you with this. WandaVision appears to be going in a certain direction. I am not going to spend a lot of time making assumptions, but I will throw this out there. The storyline that they're using does strongly fall in line with the House of M storyline that is in the comics. The idea that Wanda and Vision have kids in the comics, and those kids are not really her children, that they are figments of her imagination, that she is being manipulated to bring basically demons to Earth. And the demon, head demon, Mephisto in the comics is behind it. And it appears that while Wanda thinks she's in control of the situation, I don't know if she really is in control of the situation. Whether it's a villain like Mephisto who's involved, which is theorized because of the character Agnes on the show. Or it's been theorized that this could be a television show that would be the villain Mojo, who has his intergalactic television empire, basically. And he does things in a very immoral way to force people to comply with his television ratings. I don't even know who he competes against. I mean, you're an intergalactic television network. Who's your competition? Fox? I mean, I don't even know. Some things in Marvel Comics don't really need an explanation. You just need to admit that it happened and then just move on with your life. So, like Jeff Loeb's comics. Anyway, so I just want to take some time to explain a little bit more about S.W.O.R.D., explain more about Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and explain a little bit about where the Disney Plus shows are going. Because remember, when WandaVision is done, then you have the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And the reason why that's important is because just like anybody who watched the movies immediately after Avengers and immediately after Avengers Age of Ultron, WandaVision and Falcon the Winter Soldier serve as the immediate sequel movies of continuing character story arcs. Except they're going to be in television form in terms of episodes. They're not going to be in terms of a 2-hour movie, which I'm fine with. It gives you an opportunity to flesh things out a little bit more, allow people to engage in their creative juices a little bit more, allow the writers and the directors and the producers to really get extra creative. And listen, there's many times that when I've rewatched Marvel movies and I see deleted scenes or I see concept art of characters or ideas that would have been in the movie, I think that actually would have been a really good idea. Or I think you could have kept that in there, would have made things a little bit easier to understand. Or I watch something and I say, you know, if you would have kept that in there, it would have added a nice amount of dialogue that would have added some more substance to the movie. Now, obviously, everything in a deleted scene menu is, you know, worth keeping in a movie. That's why they're deleted scenes. But I'm finding more and more that there are certain scenes in all of these movies that could have been kept. And I think that's where the television shows are coming in. Instead of cutting things out, now you can keep more things in. And when you get to the movies, you don't have to cut out as much because there's so much in the television shows as is. So that's your little explanation for S.W.O.R.D., Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and what it has to do with WandaVision and the future of the MCU with a little dash of what I think is going on in WandaVision here on the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Hennig. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you like to enjoy the podcast, hit the subscribe button. If you're catching this on the YouTube channel, hit that like button. If you have a thought, drop a comment below, or you can shoot me a tweet at Josh Hennig on Twitter. If you're listening on Spotify, Google Play, or Apple Podcasts, make sure you hit subscribe and leave us a review. Let us know what you think of the podcast. I'm Josh Hennig. Our next pod will probably be when WandaVision is done, where we will recap the show and review what happened in the show and what it means moving forward. Don't forget, it's going to be a busy year for comic movies and television shows. Falcon and the Winter Soldier is coming out. Black Widow is coming out. The Eternals is coming out. The Morbius movie, which has to do with the Sony side of the Marvel characters, is coming out. So there's a lot of content coming out this year, and we will try to be on top of all of it right here with me, your host, Josh Hennig, on the Mutant Blitz Podcast.